Right, okay. Okay, can everybody hear? Yes, can you hear on Zoom?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we're in business. Some of this is going to overlap a bit with Jason's, but that's inevitable. I hope I don't contradict him too much. That's not inevitable, but we'll take a chance on it. Those of us lucky or just old enough to remember the Durham Conference of 1995 that provided an impetus for the founding of Astini may recall that at the end of the conference we arranged a visit to Alnwick Castle. The key is sticking. That's it. Yeah, there we go. Right. You may recall, some of you may recall, that at the end of the conference we arranged a visit to Alnwick Castle, seat of the Duke of Northumberland, where, among other things, we viewed part of a manuscript copy, I recall, of Lane's Arabic-English Lexicon. Given the Duke's considerable financial input into the exercise, the location was entirely appropriate, but we would not be so lucky today. In 2014, the printer's manuscript copy of Lane's lexicon in 40 volumes, together with 10 volumes of As-Saghani's Ubab, one of Lane's sources for the lexicon, was sold by Sotheby's for the princely sum of £962,500, over 3 times the auctioneer's estimate. Attempts to trace the buyer have so far failed. So if anyone has it on their study desk, or indeed has any information about it at all, perhaps you could let me know. Let's remind ourselves briefly, however, of the circumstances in which the work was put together. We've heard already that Lane was working in Cairo on his 3rd trip on collecting materials for the lexicon. Like his friend Robert Hay, whom we heard about from Angus yesterday, about Robert Hay's life when he returned from Egypt to Britain. Like Robert Hay, Edward Lane returned to Britain from his Egyptian travels to a completely different way of life. Indeed, his lifestyle in Britain after 1849 was not only considerably more sedentary than that of Hay, but indeed it seems almost to have been designed for lockdown. For over 25 years, Lane devoted himself to the compilation of the Arabic-English Lexicon, which remains an essential reference for students and scholars of pre-modern Arabic literature and language. Moreover, although this enterprise remains largely unexplored territory to many scholars, Lane's work occupies a unique position as it both built on and contributed to an indigenous Arabic intellectual lexicographical tradition. From 1849 until his death in 1876, Lane spent almost the whole time on the south coast, first in Hastings and subsequently in Worthing, and you've got the census records there, working on his lexicon, although despite his best efforts, it remained unfinished at the time of his death. There's the Hastings entry. You can see he describes himself about just over halfway down as an Orientalist and author. When Orientalist wasn't a dirty word. Following his move to Worthing, indeed, where he lived with other members of his family, including Sophia Paul, the author of An Englishwoman in Egypt, He is said to have left the town only once or twice, pausing only on Sundays for study of the Bible in Hebrew, as Jason has already explained. You might regard these as God's first and God's second languages, if you like, Arabic and Hebrew, though which way round they go depends on your point of view. If you look at the map of Worthing, this is slightly before Lane got there, but you can see that the possibilities are really likely to be rather limited, especially as you've just returned from the bustling city of Cairo. But he stayed there on the south coast for 27 years. And if you want to know what 27 years feels like, it's the length of time that separates the Durham conference from the seminar today. So just imagine staying in Worthing for all that length of time. That's a map Jason already explained about the post office, and the post office appears on that plan. As you can see, in this Union Place, much changed from Lane's own days. So in this short talk, I'll build on what Jason's already said, and assemblate Lane's work both in its Western context and in the far older tradition of Arabic lexicography itself. And I'll briefly explain some of the problems that Lane had to grapple with in compiling his work, which is almost universally described as remaining indispensable, despite the fact that almost 2 centuries have passed since Lane started work on it, and despite the fact that it remains to this day unfinished, or at least incomplete. I'm not going to talk about the financial problems that Lane almost inevitably encountered in publishing such a massive and singular work, which have been extensively discussed elsewhere, but rather to review some of the lexicographical problems that he faced in compiling such a work, which straddles 2 separate but interrelated cultural traditions in an arguably unique way. As an indication of the esteem in which Lane's lexicon is held, we may first note that it has proved one of the most enduring of any of the productions of British or indeed European Orientalists. You can see several editions there, one of which is on the desk. Following its initial publication in several volumes over a period of 30 years between 1863 and 1893, it has since been reprinted and reissued in a variety of formats and is now available online as well on more than one site. On the subject of moral corruption, it has also occasionally even achieved some notoriety, appearing, for example, on the North Carolina master list of disapproved publications, having been reviewed and rejected on the 16th of May 2014, though which particular entries in the lexicon occasioned this outburst of disapproval remains unknown. So first, a bit of the lexicographical background. It didn't appear out of the blue, quite the contrary. Western examples of Arabic dictionaries date from the 15th century, but for many years, the lexicon employed by most European Arabists had been Jacobus Golius's Lexicon Arabico-Latinum, published in Leiden in 1653. And this work served as a standard reference for over a century and a half, until it was replaced by another work with the same title, the Lexicon Arabico-Latinum of Georg Wilhelm Freytag, published in Halle in 4 volumes between 1830 and 1837. And there's a sample page you can see on the screen. Both of these works were in their turn heavily indebted to, indeed largely based on, works by their Arab predecessors. For not only had there been a rich tradition of Arabic lexicography for several centuries, almost exactly a millennium in fact, but it has also to be said that this tradition had at times taken some rather curious and unexpected directions. It begins with a work attributed to El-Khalil ibn Ahmad, who lived in 718 to 791 AD, entitled Kitab al-Ain. The Ain, of course, being the name of the Arabic letter that Westerners and most non-Arabs, in fact, find most difficult to pronounce. The title of this book seems odd at first. It's like sort of having an English dictionary, which you call the Book of Q or something like that, or the Book of S. The title is significant. It immediately launches us into the problem of order. How do you order a dictionary? Well, in a modern English context, I suppose that's the sort of would be regarded as a silly question. You put it in alphabetical order. But in Arabic, it's not such a silly question. And even today, almost all Arabic dictionaries are arranged not in what we would normally regard as alphabetical order, but rather under their root letters or radicals. The majority of Arabic words, like those of other Semitic languages, including Hebrew and Syriac, for example, being based on 3 or 4 root letters, effectively all of them consonants. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but we won't go into the details. Thus, to take a fairly straightforward example, any word based on the radicals or root letters N, Z, L, Nun, Say, Lam, basic meaning to go down or dismount, will be looked up under NZL, Nun, Say, Lam. And if you look at a sample page, this is a modern dictionary, you can see you've got a whole load of words based on NZL, but they don't all agree with N, they don't all begin with Nun. Some of them begin with M, Mim, Manzil, Manzili, Manzila, and so forth, or Ta, Tanazul, Tanzil, etc., and so on and so forth. This is, of course, as already briefly been touched on, it's something of a problem in a pedagogical context, as it means that students of Arabic cannot efficiently use an Arabic dictionary until they have acquired some knowledge of the structure of the language and are able to identify the roots. Well, that's the sort of present position, but not historically as easy as that. For reasons that appear a little murky today, Al-Khalil did not consider an order based on alphabetical order of radicals, which is what we've got today, to be the best one for his dictionary, but opted instead for an order based on the point of articulation of the letter in the mouth. So he starts at the bottom with the ayn, and you go up to the ghain and all these sort of and things until you end up with letters which are on the tip of your tongue or on your lips to finish with, things like M, B, and so forth. So it's entirely different from the structure of the Arabic alphabet, or indeed any alphabet itself. Not only that, but Al-Khalil had the idea that any word containing an ayn or other letter, not just words starting with the letter, would be covered in the same section, with the result that the alphabetical sections of the book grew progressively shorter, as most words would have been covered already. If you take a crude example in English, you wouldn't look up zebra under Z, because it had already been covered under B. Z-E-B-R-A, we'll ignore the vowels for the moment. B comes first, so zebra appears somewhere towards the end of that very early section. Here, with some variations, systems of this sort prevailed for at least 2 centuries, until a man called Al-Jauhari, who died around 1007, produced a work called As-Sihah, or the correct words or correct expressions, which radically changed the direction of travel. He ditched Al-Khalil's system entirely and arranged his dictionary according to the final radical, according to the end consonant. So you can take words like katab, darab, they all have B's at the end, hab, tab, kutrub, and so forth, and they'll all be found in the Ba or the B chapter of the dictionary. It's commonly assumed that Al-Jauhari chose to arrange his dictionary on the basis of the final radical as an aid to Arab poets, because most Arabic poetry involves a final consonant rhyme. But not everyone is convinced by this theory. Being based on rhyming, what is even odder is that he then chose to arrange the words not on the basis of the reverse order of consonants. So if you take katab, you expect to find BTK, batak, is put in reverse order, but rather with the first radical in second place, so it comes out as BKT. I mean, this all seems extraordinary, but which is why I've called this talk Word Games. And you can see, if you look at a summary of the various ways of classical Arabic dictionaries are arranged, you can classify them quite formally. This is Michael Carter, who's one of the experts on these sort of things, has summarized it as permutative phonological. This is Khalil's system. And then you have permutative alphabetical, which is sort of getting a bit nearer what we would think of as normal. Then you have alphabetical by final radical, which is what I've just been talking about. And then you have finally alphabetical by first radical, which is what we would regard as the normal way of composing a dictionary. So that's Al-Jauhari. Unfortunately, these exertions appear to have been too much for him. The story goes that eventually he climbed onto a minaret in Nishapur and leapt to the ground, using a pair of folding doors in an attempt to fly, with the words, "Oh people, I have done something unprecedented in this world," i.e. composed a usable dictionary, and I will now do something unprecedented for the next world. Predictably, this early attempt at human flight failed. You can see an artistic impression on the left. That's his book on the right, which is in rather beautiful which is be more about than the picture on the left. This is probably, of course, an apocryphal story. There are lots of stories of this sort in the Arabic literature tradition. Al-Jauhari, who was probably the most famous Arabic prose writer of medieval times, who lived to a ripe old age and is traditionally said to have perished when a bookcase fell on his head. Again, almost certainly an apocryphal story. Al-Jauhari's work served as a standard for several centuries, and although some dictionaries were produced using the modern alphabetical arrangement by first radical, the next major contribution to the genre, the Lisan al-Arab, the tongue of the Arabs, Manzur, lived in the 13th and 14th century, continued to follow Al-Jauhari's arrangement based on the final radical. But although the Lisan was described by John Hayward, writing in 1965 as, I quote, "to the average educated Arab, still the major reference on a par with English Oxford Dictionary," end of quote, it was not in fact the Lisan, but a work by the Persian lexicographer Al-Firuzabadi, 1329 to 1414, entitled Al-Qamus al-Muhit, or the surrounding ocean, and the massive Taj al-Arus min Jawahir al-Qamus, which is a sort of development of that work in 10 volumes by Az-Zabidi, 1732 to 91, which was described by Carter as, I quote, "subsuming the contents of practically every previous work." It was these two dictionaries that formed the basis of Lane's work. The centrality of Firuzabadi and Az-Zabidi's work in the modern Arabic lexicographical tradition may be illustrated by the fact that the word qamus, which is probably, though not everyone accepts this, derived from the Latin oceanus, ocean, Qamus has become the standard modern Arabic word for dictionary. What is equally significant in the present context is that the title page of Lane's work begins with the Arabic words Mad al-Qamus, which you can see on the title page above the English title. We might translate this or interpret it as either the extension of the Qamus or dictionary, or as the rising of the ocean or the ocean's high tide. But whatever precise meaning we put on it, what it does is put Lane's lexicon very firmly in the mainstream of the Arabic lexicographical tradition. It is also confirmed by the first page of one of Lane's notebooks preserved in the British Library, of which more later, which reads, and we've seen this already from Jason, I quote, "An Arabic and English thesaurus chiefly derived from the Lisan al-Arab and the Taj al-Arus, two works believed to be the most comprehensive and correct of all the Arabic lexicons hitherto composed, 1/6 part of the latter of which comprises the entire text of the Qamus." That's slightly cryptic, that last bit, but we don't need to dwell on it. But Lane, of course, used not just these two giants of the Arabic lexicographical tradition. His work has been aptly summed up by Michael Carter as, I quote, "essentially a consolidation of all the medieval Arabic dictionaries," end of quote. And that's quite a task. Let's turn then in a little more detail to Lane's published work. The publishing process itself, with its almost inevitable logistical, financial, and typographical problems, and the typography of the work. I mean, if you just look at it, and this is talking about something of several thousand pages, typographically, it's an enormous feat. These sort of problems have been frequently described and discussed, of course, mainly by Jason, so we don't need to spend time on that. But let's spend a few minutes just looking at the implications of the Arabic graphical tradition, in particular the order of entries. As you can see by looking at a copy of one of the book's pages, Lane's lexicon adopts an alphabetical order, what we now regard as a standard alphabetical order, which is also the standard order adopted by Fair's dictionary, the main Arabic dictionary used by more or less everybody, and also by standard modern Arabic reference dictionaries. The Taj al-Arus, however, does not use this order, being instead based on the final rather than the first radical. This meant that as Lane laboriously worked through his Arabic sources, transcribing and translating the definitions contained therein, his early notes and early drafts bore little resemblance to the finished output for which he was aiming. Unfortunately, the material necessary for unraveling this exercise in much detail seemed to be somewhat lacking. The British Library, however, has a useful and interesting collection of around a dozen bound manuscript notebooks containing early draft materials for this dictionary. And there is also some loose unbound manuscript pages also containing early draft material in the Griffith Institute in Oxford. Comparisons between the two are quite interesting, though obviously extremely detailed. Unfortunately, the Griffith Institute draft material is limited, extending, so far as I can tell, to no more than a couple of letters into the Arabic alphabet, and it has not, so far as I know, been described or analysed in any great detail. By contrast, the British Library notebooks, originally in the possession of the British Museum, are the subject of an informative article by Peter Stocks, who notes that the method by which this material was acquired by the museum remains unclear, suggesting that it may have been included with the Arabic given to the museum by Lane's widow, Nafisa or Anastasia, in 1891, or among further material purchased from his heirs recorded in the archives or the files. Alternatively, it could have been left by Lane's great-nephew, Stanley Lane Poole, 1854 to 1931, who completed the lexicon after Lane's death in 1871. However they were acquired, the British Library notebooks, like the Griffith Institute materials, arguably raised more questions than they answered, since many folios have been removed, simply torn out, in fact, ripped out, a feature that becomes more common as we progress through the alphabet, so that the last few volumes consist of little more than empty covers. Added to this is the further problem that the British Library will not allow you to photograph this material, and the few images of it available on the web are blocked. Extremely frustrating to trying to work out what exactly was going on. However, the most striking feature of this material is that at this early stage, Lane's material remained in the original order of his Arabic sources. Stock's article includes an illustration of this, and as another example, we can compare the page of one of Lane's early manuscripts, folios from the Griffith Institute, with the final published work. You can't really do this on the screen, but you've got a set of roots that begin with W, which in Arabic, as in English, is near the end of the alphabet. But because the manuscript is actually based on the final root of the A, which is at the beginning of the alphabet, in the manuscript version, these roots are right at the beginning. In the printed version, they're pretty well at the end. And you can do this sort of thing in much more detail. That's fairly easy to see what's going on. What isn't easy to see what's going on is what stage the order begins to be, Lane begins to tamper with the original order and rearrange it as he needed. And that is a somewhat complex process. Geoffrey Roper, another scholar almost as indefatigable as Lane himself in his pursuit of accuracy, and who was also at the 1995 conference, summed up the problem succinctly in the paper that he presented in 1995 as follows, I quote, "As Lane's Arabic-English dictionary was to be arranged in the normal alphabetical root order, this would logically mean that nothing could be published until the whole work was complete." End of quote. In practice, of course, we know that this was not so, as the lexicon was published in a number of discrete volumes over a period of several decades, the last parts being edited, or at least assembled, by his great nephew Stanley Lane Poole following Lane's death. But the incomplete nature of the remaining material and the fact that much of it appears to have been destroyed, or at least disappeared, makes reconstructing the precise details of the process almost impossible. We should also note that some doubts have been expressed both about Lane Poole's competence for the job and about his commitment to the task, particularly since, by his own account, he appeared to have lost interest in the task, I quote, "when the publication of the Taj el-Arus at Bulaq deprived Mr. Lane's manuscript copy of its particular importance," end of quote. That's pretty damning. Bulaq was the site of the official Egyptian printing press at this time and played a very important part in revival of the language and literature during the 19th century in particular. Stanley Lane Poole's statement, in fact, strikes me as rather extraordinary, not to say almost pathetic, but one that reminds us that Lane's lexicon was being assembled in an intense period of technological change, not simply in the West, but also in the Middle East and Islamic world itself. I mean, printing presses were irrelevant in the Middle East at the start of Lane's life, but by the time of his death, printing and, of course, increases in literacy and things follow were becoming important and widespread. In this context, it's interesting to note that some of the typological problems to which Lane was obliged to devote his attention at this time, I mean, he introduced some new character fonts and so forth, and the sheer typographical achievement of the lexicon is quite extraordinary. These problems were also being encountered by Arab authors. I instance one whom I'm particularly interested in myself, a Lebanese gentleman called Faris, who converted and so became Ahmad Faris al-Shidyak, 1804 to 1887. I mean, very much a contemporary of Lane. A man not only from a different culture, but of a completely different character from Lane, but arguably of equal or near equal lexicographical skills. He was encountering the same sort of problems as Lane. And you can see how in this field, at least, the two cultural traditions were beginning to run in parallel. It's particularly interesting that Shidyak produced a work called Al-Jasus al-Qamus, or spying on the Qamus, spying on the dictionary, which was a sort of commentary on the dictionary entitled Al-Qamus. And it's interesting to see how Arab literati were playing with words, hence word games again. You've got Al-Qamus al-Mahit, which then becomes Taj al-Arus ala Jawahir al-Qamus, then Lane's Mad al-Qamus, which stands right in the middle, Al-Jasus al-Qamus. And this is the way Arabs love, not so much today, but in pre-modern times, they love playing with titles and making puns and so on and so forth. And Lane stands right in the centre of this. That's what strikes me as so almost unique. Lane's lexicon then is still commonly described as indispensable, and indeed so it is, despite its lack of completeness. There is an additional aspect to this question. To quote Michael Carter again, ironically, it was probably Lane's work that stimulated not only the appearance of several European dictionaries, some of them, of course, explicitly or implicitly with the object of completing Lane's work. I mean, we've noted it's sort of complete, but because Stanley Lane Poole hadn't really got Lane's qualities or linguistic abilities or knowledge, the bits that he finished off are really not up to scratch. So there have been various attempts to complete the work. Anyway, to come back to Carter, Lane's work not only stimulated European activity, but also the first dictionaries by modern Arab lexicographers. For example, and he gives several examples, some by members of the Bustani, another Lebanese family. And all these Arab works follow Western methods and principles of arrangement. So in that sense, you can say that Lane's lexicon and Lane's work has almost sort of changed the course of an Arab tradition. This, of course, was not part of Lane's purpose in compiling the lexicon. I'm sure he didn't have this in mind at all. But it is a very striking judgment by a Western scholar about the significance of Lane's work. Although that's not what he was intending to do with his lexicon, quite confident he would have been pleased to receive this commendation, for it places him squarely at the meeting point of two cultural traditions in a way that strikes me as almost unique about 19th century Orientalists. Thank you.